thinking about organizing things and information overload for the last 4 years as I've been writing it. And I was talking to my colleague Daniel Levintin, who wrote the excellent book Thinking Fast and Slow, as I was writing the book. And I said, if there was one big idea that you wanted to transmit to people that you didn't put in your book, what would that be? And he said, the pre-mortem. And I said, what's that? He said, well, you all know, when something goes wrong, the police come in or an investigator and they do a post-mortem to figure out what went wrong. He said he finds it very helpful in his own life to do a pre-mortem. Think ahead of time about all the things that could go wrong. Now, different people have various compulsions about this. Some people think about 1,000 things that could go wrong. Some people think about a handful of them. But the idea is take some time regularly to think about the things that could go wrong and deal with them. If you've ever hidden a key under the mat, that's a pre-mortem. You realize that if you get home in the dead of a Chicago winter and you can't get into your front door, having a spare key somewhere is a good solution to the problem. So you plan ahead. Or you take a picture of your credit card front and back with your cell phone so that if your credit card's stolen and you want to call the company to let them know to cancel the card, where was the number? Oh, well, it was written on the back of the credit card, which you don't have anymore, but at least you have a photograph of that number on your cell phone. And as I started thinking about pre-mortems, I started thinking that one of the biggest sources of stress for us these days that we really can deal with is medical decision-making. Medical decision-making has gotten increasingly complex because doctors have less time to spend with us. There's more data out there about medical conditions. And so among the many dozens of things that I talk about in the book, I wanted to just close by sharing with you one tiny little slice of how to better organize your time in your life, and that is to think ahead about how you're going to make medical decisions. Put in place certain questions or certain attitudes about it now. The problem is that when you're sitting in that doctor's office and you're getting the diagnosis that I talk about in the book, I want to just close by sharing with you one tiny little slice of how to better organize your time in your life, and that is to think ahead about how you're going to make medical decisions. Put in place certain questions or certain attitudes about it now. The problem is that when you're sitting in that doctor's office and you're getting the diagnosis, and sooner or later it's either going to be you or somebody you love who's going to have some important decision to make. And that's a stressful moment. Why? You're tense, and the doctor's throwing out terms you've never heard before. You're trying to imagine what your loved one's life is going to be like. Cortisol kicks in again, and you remember what that does. So get in the habit of asking a series of questions. Let's take a simple example. You go to the doctor. The doctor says, I just got your labs back. I'm a little worried about your cholesterol. Well, I'd like to start you on a cholesterol-lowering drug, a statin. You've probably heard of statins. You know that having high cholesterol is associated with heart disease, increased risk of stroke. It seems like a good idea to lower your cholesterol. So you say, sure, I'll take the drug. But there's a question that you should ask in the doctor's office, which is for a statistic that most doctors don't want to talk about, and drug companies want to talk about even less. That statistic is called the number needed to treat. How many of you have heard of this? Not so many. The number needed to treat is the statistic for how many people have to take that drug or undergo a surgery or treatment before even one person is helped. Now, you're thinking that's kind of a crazy number. The number should be 1. My doctor wouldn't give me something if it wasn't going to help me. But medicine doesn't work that way. You have to give medicine or treatment to many people before one person is helped. For one of the leading statins in the United States today, what do you suppose the number needed to treat is? It's 300. 300 people have to take this drug before one person is helped by it. So you're thinking, okay, well, what the heck, I'll take it. My insurance is paying for it. I don't care. But the next question you should ask your doctor is, what are the side effects? And for this particular statin, the doctor will tell you, well, the side effects happen in 5% of the people. They include debilitating muscle and joint pain, severe gastrointestinal distress, nausea, fatigue, and dizziness. So you think, well, 5%, what do I care? That's 1 in 20 chance. I'll take the drug anyway. But if you work out the numbers, let's see, we were talking about 300 people have to take the drug. There's a 5% chance of side effects. That means 5 out of 100. So for these 300 people, 15 people are going to have the side effects, but only one person is going to be helped. You're 15 times more likely to be harmed by the drug than to be helped by it. Now, I'm not saying whether you should take the statin or not. I'm just saying that you have to prepare yourself for these kinds of conversations ahead of time so that at the moment of truth, you know which questions to ask in order to push the conversation forward and to be able to participate in one of the cornerstones of medicine, which is informed consent. Before you consent to a procedure, you need to be informed about it. And the way medical treatment is going, where doctors have less and less time to spend with us, you have to become an advocate for your own health care. You have to know which questions to ask to move the conversation forward. Now, if you think that I just pulled this statistic about this particular statin out of the air for its shock value, this is actually quite typical. For one of the most widely performed surgeries on men over 50, prostate removal, for prostate cancer, the number needed to treat is 49. That is, 49 surgeries are done for each one person who is helped. 48 of the surgeries are unnecessary, and the side effects in that instance are 50%. 50% of men experience side effects so severe that the majority of men who undergo a prostate removal say they wish they hadn't done it. This idea of moving the conversation forward with the right questions is something that's fascinated me for a long time, and I devote a fair amount of time in the book to it. It's something that you can train yourself to do just by example or by looking at how people make important decisions. I'll give you one last example. General Stanley McChrystal, who was the head of the Joint Special Operations Forces in Iraq, as you know, he describes when he went to a briefing with a local unit in a town, and he asked the unit there what they had by way of intelligence. And they say, well, we've recruited 250 Iraqis who are going to provide information to U.S. troops about what's going on here. And McChrystal's head of intelligence, Mike Flynn, asked the single question that moved the conversation forward. He said to the local unit head, of your 250 informants, describe to me the most important and valuable of them, assuming that the rest of them aren't nearly as helpful as the number one. And when the unit commanders described that number one, they realized they didn't really have much at all. The very best one they had was not reliable and not providing very helpful information. So the idea is that one way to organize your time, your life, your home, and your workplace is to think for every decision you have to make and for every situation you're in, what's the one question I could ask that will really make a difference in moving things forward? Thank you very much. That's all I have. My name is Daniel Levintin. I'm a neuroscientist and professor at McGill University. My new book is The Organized Mind, Thinking Straight in the Age of Information Overload. I would say the top tip is to externalize things, to use the external environment as your memory in any way that you can. Just one example might be if you hear that it's going to rain tomorrow, don't try to remember it. As soon as you hear the weather report, take your umbrella out of the closet and put it by the door so that the environment is reminding you of something. And writing things down. tomorrow, don't try to remember it. As soon as you hear the weather report, take your umbrella out of the closet and externalize things. So use the external environment as your memory in any way that you can. Hand. Just one example might be if you hear that it's going to rain tomorrow, don't try to remember it. As soon as you hear the weather report, take your umbrella out of the closet and put it by the door so that the environment is reminding you to take it. And writing things down on paper is very helpful. It turns out that for neurobiological reasons, when you write something longhand, it requires deeper processing. So you're not only getting it on
Are you okay, Casper? No. Where are you?
on paper, but you're making it a stronger memory, which is good, as opposed to typing or entering it into a computer. A lot of this came from the experts I spoke with, people who are really at the top of their game. I call them HSPs, highly successful people. I spoke to the logistics office, the admiral who was in charge of logistics for all the United States Middle East operations. He prioritizes things. He makes all these lists on index cards. In the morning when he wakes up and shows up for work, he goes through the cards and might reorder them if the priorities have changed. And then throughout the day, he'll check this to-do list. So I've started doing that. I do what David Allen, the efficiency expert, calls a mind-clearing exercise. At least once a day, I just take 5 minutes to write down everything in my head. head that's worrying me or bothering me or nagging at me, so that I can put it somewhere in a pile, like something to do today, tomorrow, or something I don't have to deal with for a week or more. Many of us feel these days that when we get home from work, we're still thinking about work. Yeah, thinking we could have done more, or, why didn't I figure out how to solve this problem, or, oh, I forgot to do that. And then when you're at work, you're thinking about all the things you wanted to do at home, and you end up being in neither place. And I think that's no way to live. When I'm talking about being organized, I'm not talking about turning us all into automatons like Mr. Spock. I'm talking about being able to focus your attention on what's in front of you, which allows you to make more time for spontaneity and creativity, and to spend more time doing the things you really love and spending time with the people you love. Thank you. We are living in an age of information overload. In 2011, the average American took in 5 times as much information as we did in 1986. As you just heard, there are 300 exabytes of information in the world now. That's a 300 with 18 zeros followed by it. There's been more information generated in the last few years than in all of human history before it. The 5 times as much information we take in today as opposed to 1986, that's the equivalent of reading 175 newspapers every day from cover to cover. If you went shopping 30 years ago, the average grocery store carried 9,000 products. Today, that same grocery store carries 40,000 products, and yet most of us get all of our shopping needs met in about 150 items, which means that you have to ignore 38,500 items every time you go to the grocery store in order to fill your basket. That's information overload. And maybe you think, well, I can't keep up with anything at work anymore. I can't keep up with my emails. At least I can go home and watch YouTube for an hour and keep up with what's happening there. But you should know that every hour that goes by, there are 6,000 hours of new video uploaded to YouTube, which means that for every hour you watch, you're already 5,999 hours behind. So what do we do about it? We multitask. We try to juggle a whole bunch of things at once. But what we've discovered as neuroscientists in the last few years is that multitasking is a myth. It doesn't really exist. The brain just doesn't work that way. You're not actually juggling 5 or 6 things at once. Instead, the brain is rapidly shifting from one activity to the next in little 5-second increments or so. And as a consequence, you're not really focusing your attention on any one thing. You're fracturing your attention into a bunch of little bits. And what does this do to the brain? Well, it leads to decision fatigue, and it leads to the production of cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. It's toxic. You don't want to have that in your bloodstream. It's part of the fight or flight reaction. Cortisol leads, among other things, to cloudy thinking. So while you're doing all this multitasking and you think you're really good at it, in fact, you're not. The feeling that you're good at it comes from the cloudy thinking produced by cortisol, and there have been a number of studies that show that people who multitask, well, actually it's a bunch of unitasking, it's not really multitasking. They think they're getting a lot done. At the end of the day, they've gotten much less done, and their work is rated as being less creative and of a lower quality. So why is it we think we're so good at it, apart from the cortisol? Well, I'm here to tell you as a neuroscientist that there's one thing the brain is very good at, and that's self-delusion. The fact that your brain is telling you you're good at it should not be taken as evidence. My colleague Mike Gazzaniga says the entire left hemisphere is the great confabulator. It just makes stuff up all the time. So take it from me, multitasking doesn't work. A number of studies show this. It's better to focus in on one thing. Now, I mentioned decision fatigue a moment ago. All these episodes of task switching, of moving from one thing to another, use up nutrients in the brain. There's a structure that my colleagues and I discovered right here in the center of the brain that acts as a switch whenever you switch from task to task. If you put your finger right on the top of your head, about an inch below is this structure called the insula. I don't mean that we discovered the insula, but we discovered that it's what shifts when you're going from one task to another. And it's also what is involved when you're making a series of decisions. The reason this is important is that neurons are living cells with a metabolism. They need nutrients in order to function. They primarily run on glucose. Glucose is the fuel of the brain. Every time you make a decision, every time you switch from one task to another, you're burning up a little bit of glucose. And after a morning of task switching or decision making, if you're feeling depleted, it's because you've literally depleted the glucose stores in your brain. And that leads to feelings of fatigue, cloudy thinking, and poor decision making. This idea of decision overload is very real and has now been corroborated by a number of neuroscientific and behavioral studies. So in one series of experiments, people are asked to make a sequence of meaningless, trivial, unimportant decisions, like whether to eat Honey Nut Cheerios or multigrain Cheerios, whether to use the 2% milk or the 1% milk, whether to use a tablespoon or a teaspoon, whether to write with a green pen or a purple pen. These are not momentous decisions on which your life hangs in the balance, but after a sequence of those, they are given very important decisions to make, such as suppose you were just diagnosed with cancer, here are the statistics about radiation therapy versus surgery, which would you choose? Or you've got this amount of money for your retirement, are you going to put it into stocks or bonds? Here are the various rates of return. After making a series of these trivial decisions, people were really poor at making the important ones. Why? Decision fatigue. There's a limited amount of decisions that you can make in the day before you run out of glucose, before you run out of juice. So what the experts recommend is that you move the important decisions up to the beginning of the day and try to minimize the number of unimportant ones you have to make. One of the big distractors in our life, certainly for people over the age of 20, is email. I say over the age of 20 because most people under the age of 20 don't email that much. They see it as an old people's medium. They're mostly texting. But with email, how many of you feel as though you can't keep up, that it comes in faster than you can deal with it, that there's maybe 100 or 200 unread or undealt with emails in your inbox? The problem with email is that each one comes in, and you hear that ping, you've got to make a series of decisions. Do I look at it now or later? Now that I'm looking at it, do I reply to it? Do I forward it to someone else? Do I have to get more information before I can respond? Do I file it somewhere? That was 5 or 6 decisions right there. And that's just one email. So you can see that if emails are coming in all morning long, decision fatigue sets in. It's very hard to stay alert and do your job, or for that matter, enjoy your leisure time. So what experts are recommending is that you shut your email program off for productivity periods to avoid the distraction. I have a new book out called The Organized Mind, and I've been thinking about organizing things and information overload for the last 4 years as I've been writing it. And I was talking to my colleague Daniel Levintin, who wrote the excellent book Thinking Fast and Slow, as I was writing the book. And I said, if there was one big idea that you wanted to transmit to people that you didn't put in your book, what would that be? And he said, the pre-mortem. And I said, what's that? He said, well, you all know, when something goes wrong, the police come in or an investigator and they do a post-mortem to figure out what went wrong. He said he finds it very helpful in his own life to do a pre-mortem. Think ahead of time about all the things that could go wrong. Now, different people have various compulsions about this. Some people think about 1,000 things that could go wrong. Some people think about a handful of them. But the idea is take some time regularly to think about the things that could go wrong and deal with them. And keep on doubling. So, enormous amount of information. What can we do about it? Well, what many of us do about it is we multitask. We do a whole bunch of things at once, figuring that that way we can manage all of the stuff that's coming at us from all different sides. But it turns out that multitasking is a myth. And there's now ample research that justifies and supports this. I know that it's part of Google's culture to have transmitted this information to all of you. Multitasking does not exist. What's actually happening in the brain is sequential tasking. The brain is rapidly shifting from one thing to the next. It's doing it so quickly and seamlessly that you don't really notice, but that's what's happening. What you end up with is attention that's been fractionated into little 3 to 5 second bits, and you're not able to actually sustain attention on any one thing. Multitasking can release the stress hormone cortisol, which might make you feel at the end of a couple hours like your head has been in a salad spinner. Multitasking is also responsible for that mental fog you feel, partly due to the release of cortisol. So you're not saving time, you're wasting time. There are actually very few jobs that require multitasking. One of them is air traffic controller. Another is simultaneous translator at the UN. And those jobs have high costs if the worker makes a mistake, right? I mean, it's obvious if you make a mistake as an air traffic controller, the consequences can be calamity, disastrous. Same for simultaneous translators at the UN. You get one word wrong, you may have a war on your hands, right? So these jobs, it's no coincidence that they have mandated breaks. People in those high-stress jobs, air traffic controllers, for example, they're not allowed to work more than 45 or 60 minutes without taking a 15 to 30-minute break. That's their duty cycle. A couple of other jobs that require multitasking come to mind. One is kindergarten teacher, and the other is publicist or social network consultant, and another is journalist, breaking news journalist. But apart from that, it's not really a job requirement for most of us, and it ends up, at the end of the day, based on a number of productivity studies, the people who were multitasking were getting less done by any measure than the people who were unitasking. Now, why does it feel like we're multitasking? Well, it's an illusion, and as a neuroscientist, I can tell you the brain is very good at self-delusion. That's one thing that it's really good at. And we see it in a lot of different ways. I mean, I for one know that I look a lot better after I'm drinking. But people tell me that that's self-delusion. I'm also a lot more clever and I'm a better fighter after I've had 2 drinks, or so I think. So the brain doesn't always have insights into what it's good at and what it's not good at. We're deceiving ourselves when we think we're multitasking. We really are. The productivity studies bear this out. So what can you do about it? Well, we can take a tip from the air traffic controllers and simultaneous translators, and we can take breaks. And workers who are allowed to do this in a number of studies and a number of industries end up being more productive and creating better quality work. So you have to decide what the appropriate breaks are depending on the kind of work you do and depending on how your brain works. But a good rule of thumb is every couple hours take 15 minutes off. Naps are also very helpful. Short naps, even 10 or 15-minute nap in the middle of the day, can be the equivalent of an hour and a half of extra sleep the night before, and it can raise your effective IQ by 10 points. So naps are a good thing. And I read somewhere that Google has nap rooms, at least in some of the facilities. Is this true? Our productivity studies bear this out. So what can you do about it? Well, we can take a tip from the air traffic controllers and simultaneous translators, and we can take breaks. And workers who are allowed to do this in a number of studies and a number of industries end up being more productive and creating better quality work. So you have to decide what the appropriate breaks are depending on the kind of work you do and depending on how your brain works. But a good rule of thumb is every couple hours take 15 minutes off. Naps are also very helpful. Short naps, even 10 or 15-minute nap in the middle of the day can be the equivalent of an hour and a half of extra sleep the night before, and it can raise your effective IQ by 10 points. So naps are a good thing, and I read somewhere that Google has nap rooms, at least in some of the facilities. Is this true? So this is already a part of your culture, but I'm saying it because this is being taped, and this will go out beyond Google, I guess. But other companies have been promoting this too. Safeway stores, the grocery chain in East Bay, has nap rooms and exercise rooms. These are all critical because of the underlying neurophysiology. The nap helps to restore your depleted sources of glucose in the brain, which I'll get to in a minute. And the breaks allow you to enter a different attentional mode. And I want to talk about that for a minute, what the vacations that you take are doing for you neurophysiologically, and what the breaks and the naps are doing. So there are 2 dominant modes of attention in the human brain. One goes by the rather inelegant name of the task-positive network. More colloquially, this is the central executive of the brain. It's the part of your brain that is engaged in a task. and you're not distracted. So you might be writing a report or doing research or reading a book, engaging in a conversation, but if you're focused and you're not distracted, you're in that mode. The second dominant mode of the brain is called the task negative network, and it's when you're not doing a task and your mind is wandering. And this is a part of the brain, a network of brain regions that's been called the default mode of the brain, because it exerts a pull on that other part of your brain, and it's a kind of natural state that the brain wants to go to. So I'm sure you've all had this experience that you're reading a book, and at some point your eyes get ahead of where you are in the book. And you realize, well, your eyes have been following the words, but your brain hasn't, and you've got to go back a ways and figure out, well, that's the mind-wandering mode has kicked in. It's not that your brain has shut off, you were just thinking other thoughts, maybe stimulated by what you had read. And so this mind-wandering mode turns out to be very different from the task engagement mode, because it's where thoughts that are loosely connected seamlessly flow into one another, like in a dream. That's why we call it daydreaming. And you begin to see connections between things that you didn't see as connected before. It's loosely affiliated thoughts flow into one another. Non-linear kinds of thinking. Sometimes juxtapositions of different ideas. This is the mode of thinking where your most creative acts are likely to occur, and where problem solving is apt to occur. So I'm sure you have this experience that you're trying to solve some problem, work something out, you focus on it, you're getting nowhere, you drop it for a while, you might be out shopping, and suddenly it hits you, the answer. That's the daydreaming mode having kicked in. It usually kicks in when you're doing something else that doesn't require a lot of focus, and so the daydreaming mode takes over. And if you use a little bit of self-reflection and think back, or the next time it happens, analyze what's going on, it's probably that the solution was something that wasn't obvious before, or you would have thought of it. It's something that required a kind of non-linear thinking, or putting together, piecing together disparate ideas you hadn't seen connected before. So problem solving depends on this other mode of the brain, and it's essential for all of us who are engaged in creative pursuits to be able to go back and forth between the two modes. Now, attention switching, such as we do during multitasking, and decision making, deplete fuel in the brain. Specifically, they deplete glucose. So glucose is the fuel that neurons need. Neurons are living cells with metabolism, and they need glucose in order to function. And glucose is not in an unlimited supply. Every decision that you make depletes a little glucose. Every time you switch tasks, it depletes a little bit. And it turns out that even small decisions deplete your stores of glucose as much as big ones do. So if you're trying to decide which breakfast cereal to buy at the store, or whether to use a red pen or a blue pen for something, these seemingly inconsequential decisions are still decisions as far as your neurons are concerned, and they're competing with for mental energy with important decisions, like whether to put your pension into stocks or bonds, or how to resolve some interpersonal problem you have. They're competing with trying to remember things like you have to pay your electric bill on a certain day at a certain time. Whatever the decision is, it's depleting these neural resources. Kicking into the daydreaming mode is one of the best ways that we know of basically hitting the reset button in the brain and allowing the glucose to build up again. Taking a nap is another good way, as is taking a food. So if you're trying to decide which breakfast cereal to buy at the store, or whether to use a red pen or a blue pen for something, these seemingly inconsequential decisions are still decisions as far as your neurons are concerned, and they're competing with for mental energy with important decisions, like whether to put your pension into stocks or bonds, or how to resolve some interpersonal problem you have. They're competing with trying to remember things like you have to pay your electric bill on a certain day at a certain time. Whatever the decision is, it's depleting these neural resources. Kicking into the daydreaming mode is one of the best ways that we know of basically hitting the reset button in the brain and allowing the glucose to build up again. Taking a nap is another good way, as is taking a vacation. Vacations are very important, it turns out.
Yeah.
when I'm talking about taking breaks and vacations, I'm not talking about, oh, I'm going to stop working, I'm going to do email, or I'm going to watch television. Those are not breaks. I mean, a real break, the most restorative kinds of breaks are things where your mind can really wander. And each of us has a different way that we can kickstart that process. It might be exercise, it might be walking in nature, or a walk around the block. Turns out there are evolutionary reasons why exposing yourself to nature enables you to hit the reset button. Being around natural things like trees, water, bodies of water, mountains, flowers and shrubs, that's a very restorative environment. I used to work in the laboratory at Amos Tversky here at Stanford, who did a lot of work on decision making, and every afternoon he and Danny Kahneman and his colleague would take a walk around the Stanford campus, and as Danny reports in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, most of their greatest ideas came from those walks, and that's no coincidence. This is a restorative, creative act. So exercise, taking walks, taking a nap, literature, reading. Reading stimulates this mind-wandering mode and helps you to hit the reset button. The pull that we feel against all of this very natural thing that we feel is that there's so much going on and we're asked to do so much more now than ever before that we feel as though if we stop our work for just 5 minutes, we're going to fall behind. You know, you already have 300 unread emails in your inbox, so how can you take 5 minutes off? But the productivities are very clear on this. If you take off those 5 minutes, at the end of the day you get back more than that. And overtime is even worse. In a number of studies, people who work 60-hour weeks don't get an extra 20 over their 40-hour-a-week counterparts. They end up getting only 7 hours of extra work done. So you're putting in 3 hours to get 1 hour of work done, according to research. Not in every profession, not in every case, this is on average. And you can certainly think of counterexamples. If there's a crisis, I mean, look at the Ebola workers in Liberia, or if there's an earthquake and rescue workers, of course, it's worth getting those 7 hours is worth them putting in 20. But in daily life, in your daily work, if it's not an emergency situation, it's worth looking at. Am I willing to put in 20 to get 7? It may not be the best use of your time and the company's time. So what can we do about this? How can we create this kind of focus that I'm talking about? One thing that experts do is they enforce productivity hours. They'll set aside a certain time of day or several times during the day when they don't want to be interrupted. And they turn off their email program.
Never read 咯，他买错了，他买成 maximum super sour，你要去講啊？
报废了这个 video。I will do that. No time for it.
Okay, I do for you. It's just not enough time. I cut for you.
I don't know when.
They might even turn off their phone, and they allow themselves to enter a state of undistracted, sustained concentration. care about, whether at work or at home, whether it's time with family or time on a much-loved hobby. They're more enjoyable when you're fully immersed in them, not when you're trying to do 5 things at once. So these productivity hours are very important. And people always say, well, I can't turn off my email. Something urgent might come in. Well, the answer to that is you just open up another account, a private account, and you give that address only to those people who need to reach you urgently. So a number of successful and productive people do this. They might give the address only to 8 or 10 people, maybe your boss, somebody who works for them, a couple of coworkers, immediate family members, and you can instruct those people, only use this address if it's urgent. If you're sending me a video of a cat playing the piano or an invitation to a party that's a month away, use my regular address, because that account's going to be turned off most of the day. This is the one where I can be reached urgently. This kind of partitioning is what highly successful people do. I interviewed a number of CEOs and successful artists, musicians, Nobel Prize winners, scientists, military leaders, and government leaders for the book. And one of the things that was a thread through all of this in trying to understand their productivity is they really partition things like that. And I think I find the idea refreshing, because if you're like me, for a lot of your working adult life, when you've been at home, you've probably been thinking about work. And when you're at work, you're probably thinking about home, and you find that you're not really in either place fully. And that's no way to live. It's better to be fully in one activity or the other. So those are some of the tips for avoiding distraction. Now, I talked about and I'll come back to this in a minute. I want to shift and talk about brain extenders. This is a very simple idea. The idea is that if you want to be more productive and creative, don't load up your brain with stuff that doesn't need to be there. Right? So a great example is you hear on the weather report that it's going to rain tomorrow. Why stick in your head, oh, I've got to remember to bring an umbrella, which is going to take up neural resources. Put that information in the environment. Go to the closet, get your umbrella, put it by the door, and then it will remind you to take it when it's time. If you're the kind of person who loses your keys, get a key hook and put it by the front door, or a decorative bowl on a console table by the front door. If the keys always go there, you don't have to think about where they are. Another example of brain extenders are doors in office buildings. Why should you have to remember how every individual door in your life opens and closes? In big buildings, usually this information is offloaded to the environment. If the door has a big horizontal bar across it, you know you have to push it and the door's going to open out. And if it has a kind of U-shaped handle on it, you know you're supposed to pull it and that the door is going to open in. You don't have to remember this or keep track of it. The psychologist J.J. Gibson called these affordances. They afford the way in which they're supposed to be used. You HCI people know this term, I'm sure. And we can do that in all different ways in our environment to externalize. The other thing we do to externalize is we write things, take it when it's time. If you're the kind of person who loses your keys, get a key hook and put it by the front door, or a decorative bowl on a console table by the front door. If the keys always go there, you don't have to think about where they are. Another example of brain extenders are doors in office buildings. Why should you have to remember how every individual door in your life opens and closes? In big buildings, usually this information is offloaded to the environment. If the door has a big horizontal bar across it, you know you have to push it and the door's going to open out. And if it has a kind of U-shaped handle on it, you know you're supposed to pull it and that the door's going to open in. You don't have to remember this or keep track of it. The psychologist J.J. Gibson called these affordances. They afford the way in which they're supposed to be used. You HCI people know this term, I'm sure. And we can do that in all different ways in our environment to externalize. The other thing that we do to externalize is we write things down. As soon as you put something on paper, your brain no longer needs to keep track of it. Paper is actually better for remembering things than typing it. Because of the neural circuitry involved in writing something longhand, you end up processing the information more deeply. So writing it down, in many cases, is better than typing it down. Now, Google has, of course, been the de facto information source for the last number of years, replacing long trips to the library, combing through irrelevant pages and dusty books to find the one fact that you were looking for. As my colleague Christopher Chabris says, we've outsourced to Google a massive volume of research chores that used to take anywhere from minutes to months of trawling through reference sources, making phone calls, and visiting archives. Our searches are an order of magnitude more efficient and less time-consuming than 20 years ago. And this is an example of externalization. We no longer need to carry around facts like in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or the sun is 93 million miles away, or what the time difference is between here and Mumbai. We can get it in half a second on an object we hold in our hands that has more processing power than Apollo mission control had. So this is a great example of a brain extender, and I think that it's a very important way that we can become more productive and efficient. Don't keep up here things that don't need to be up here, and you understand this, I think, better than anyone. The last thing I wanted to talk about is decision making. With all of this information at our fingertips, we have the power to make decisions that we couldn't make before. And a good example of that is in the medical domain. It used to be you just went to the doctor and you did whatever the doctor told you. But now there's all kinds of information available through the internet that can help you to make an informed choice. There's so much more information now than before. By some estimates, the amount of scientific information in the world in the last 20 years equals all of the scientific information generated up to that point in history. So we've doubled scientific information in 20 years by some estimates, and there's enormous amounts of medical data. It turns out that for some of the most difficult decisions we make in medicine, whether to get a treatment or not, whether to take a drug or not take it, whether to have surgery or radiation treatment if you've got cancer, these different kinds of decisions, doctors aren't schooled in a lot of the decision-making processes that need to be applied here. It's not part of their curriculum. They don't always know how to acquire the information, and once they do, they don't know how to analyze it. And I think we're at an age where it's becoming increasingly apparent that we all need to take control of our own medical decision-making, and we need to become proactive and responsible. And the information age has allowed that. Of course, the difficult thing is separating the digital wheat from the digital chaff, trying to figure out what is good information and what is not. So one of the things I think we need to do is start teaching our children right away information literacy. I think the primary mission of education has to shift. It used to be trying to teach children a bunch of facts. Now they can get the facts. I think what we have to do is start teaching them how to use those facts, to use them intelligently and creatively in order to help solve the world's problems. So to go back to the medical case, if you're looking up a particular prescription drug and trying to figure out whether you want to take it or not, the first thing that's part of information literacy that every 8-year-old should know is, whose website are you on? Is it the drug manufacturer's? Might there be biased information there? Is it the site for the manufacturer of a competing drug? Maybe it's some sort of shadow site for the manufacturer of a competing drug, under the name AmericansForBetterHealthcare.com or something like that, and it's really a shill for another drug company. These are questions that are important to ask so that we can be informed. And why is it that these are making such a big deal out of medical decisions? Well, I walk through several examples in the book. I'll give you one. Suppose you go to your doctor, and your doctor says that your cholesterol is high, and that she wants to start you on statins. You've heard of statins. You know that they're cholesterol-lowering drugs. And so you think, sure, why not? Sounds like a good, I'd like to have lower cholesterol. Well, the first question you should ask is, what is the number needed to treat? Now, this is a little-known statistic that doctors don't like talking about, and pharmaceutical companies like even less. It's the number of patients that have to take a drug for it to be effective on one patient. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's crazy. The number should be 1. I mean, why would my doctor be giving me a medication that's not going to help me? But it doesn't actually work out that way, because there are a lot of medications that don't work on everybody. In fact, most don't work on everybody. I can only think of 1 or 2 medications where the number needed to treat is 1. And they're for rare cancers where only a few hundred people a year get. For most of us, the drugs aren't going to work on everybody. So think about this for a minute. What do you suppose the number needed to treat for one of the more popular statins is? How many people need to take it before one person gets cured? For the one I'm thinking about, and which Penguin's lawyer said I'm not allowed to say out loud, for the one I'm thinking of, the number needed to treat is 300. And I didn't just pull this out to shock you. This is a typical number needed to treat for pharmaceutical products. 300 people take the drug, 1 person gets better. So now you're thinking, well, okay, I don't want to have high cholesterol. I'm sure I'm willing to take the chance of being the 1 in 300 that'll help, because I'm helping to reduce the chance of my getting a heart attack. But then the next question you should ask your doctor is, well, wait a minute, what are the chances of side effects for this drug, and what are they? Well, for the drug I'm thinking about, one of the most popular cholesterol-lowering drugs, the side effects occur in about 5% of the people who take it, and the side effects include severe debilitating muscle and joint pain, gastrointestinal distress, diarrhea, blood in the stool, blood in the urine, headaches, nausea, and dizziness. These are awful. 5% of the people are getting, well, that's not a lot, but if we take, 5 out of 100, but if we take the 300 that we're talking about, that means 15 people are going to have the side effects for every 1 person who's helped. You're 15 times more likely to experience the side effect than the cure. So now the calculation becomes a little different about whether you want to take this thing or not. This is the kind of information literacy and decision-making literacy that I lay out in the book, and that I think we should be teaching beginning at, to 8-year-olds. I mean, some of the more nuanced things, maybe not till high school. And it involves things that some of you engineers know, Bayesian inferencing, updating your estimates of probabilities with new information. But I think this is very important. And I think that getting back to the idea of what we should teach our children, just to, not to put too fine a point on it, but they're going to encounter the facts on their own. They already know how to find out information. What they're not getting trained in adequately, I think, is how to evaluate those sources of information, and how to use them creatively and intelligently. And I think solving the biggest problems in the world will require a combination of that, knowing how to use information, and having adequate opportunities to let the daydreaming or creative mode kick in. I mean, let's face it, the biggest problems we're looking at in the world right now, aggression across borders and within countries, poverty, unequal distribution of wealth, climate change. If the problems had simple, linear solutions, somebody would have figured them out already. It's more likely that they'll come from people who are thinking outside the box, as we say, thinking creatively. And for that to happen, it's not going to happen while you're doing 10 things at once and giving 5 seconds of attention to each one. It's going to happen when you have a sustained period to deal with it. Now, when I talk about being organized, I don't want there to be a misunderstanding. I'm not talking about all of us being like Mr. Spock and being completely regimented and unemotional and logical all the time. What I'm talking about is being able to bring more efficiency to the workday, so that at the end of the day you can close the door on it and have more time for spontaneity, for creativity, for time with loved ones, and for fun. I'm talking about being able to introduce those elements more regularly in your life because you're not feeling like you're always behind, that you're able to make the most out of every minute and every opportunity. So that's all I have to say, and I'd be happy to take questions, and above all, I'm grateful to all of you for spending this afternoon with me. Thank you very much.
One of the things you touched on is the rapidity with which you can make decisions, how quickly you can do your thing, your work, and so on. And yet, one of the things that Google does is it tries to minimize the amount of time it takes to get a response. You type a query, and it's 300 milliseconds or whatever. And so we encourage a very rapid iteration, a very rapid query response cycle. And yet there's evidence to suggest that sometimes slowing the pace of work down increases accuracy, increases depth of processing, and so on. How do you make these sort of personal evaluations in your life, in your decision-making process?
I try to figure out whether I try to prioritize my decision making and separate the big ones from the little ones, and deal with the big ones in the morning when my gumption is at high. And then I follow the advice of David Allen and other efficiency experts. Try to figure out what do I need in order to make this decision, in order to push this forward, especially if one's been lingering for a while. Do I need more information? If so, where am I going to get that? Can I delegate the acquisition of that information to someone else? If they're an expert, I can ask. Do I need time to just think it over? This is what judges do, of course. They often get all the information and then allow themselves a couple of days to ruminate about it, especially when there are big consequences. You raised another point about the rapidity of information, and
and so we encourage a very rapid iteration, a very rapid query response cycle. And yet there's evidence to suggest that sometimes slowing the pace of work down increases accuracy, increases depth of processing, and so on. How do you make these sort of personal evaluations in your life, in your decision-making process?
I try to figure out whether I try to prioritize my decision making and separate the big ones from the little ones, and deal with the big ones in the morning when my gumption is at high. And then I follow the advice of David Allen and other efficiency experts. Try to figure out what do I need in order to make this decision, in order to push this forward, especially if one's been lingering for a while. Do I need more information? If so, where am I going to get that? Can I delegate the acquisition of that information to someone else? If they're an expert, I can ask. Do I need time to just think it over? This is what judges do, of course. They often get all the information and then allow themselves a couple of days to ruminate about it, especially when there are big consequences. You raised another point about the rapidity of information, and Google has made searches an order of magnitude more efficient than they used to be, and most of the time, especially Google Scholar for somebody in my line of work is very helpful. Most of the time you get exactly what you're looking for, and if not, it's not too far off. But I was thinking the other day about how I wrote a lot of this book in libraries. And I would be walking to a shelf to get a book and something else would catch my eye. And I would start looking at it, and it was something that was fascinating and wonderful that I didn't even know I was interested in. And that would set me off on some nonlinear but wonderful path. And I was thinking, what I'd like to see in Google, I'm sure everybody comes here and tells you stuff you've already thought of. I'd like to see a serendipity button where when I get my search results that are very accurate and focused, there's a separate column of the near misses. Things that aren't exactly the right one, but that are sort of related, the kinds of things I might have found if I was walking along in a bookstore or a library, that on the shelf next to it. I would find that a nice feature. Of course, I can use somebody else's search engine and get those automatically. I mean, unintentionally, automatically.
Your tips were really helpful. I was wondering if there's anything somebody with an attention deficit disorder can do to improve and organize their lives better.
So attention deficit disorder is an interesting phenomenon. It really does exist. Many people with attention deficit disorder are able to be especially creative because of the way their mind works, going from one unrelated thought to another. One of the difficulties, of course, is that people with ADD tend to start a lot of projects and not finish any of them. So I think the greatest thing is when somebody with ADD is paired with somebody in the workplace who may not have a desire to be particularly creative and is a real kind of focused, logical, get things done person. And that person can, working together as a team, they can really accomplish great things. In fact, some companies do this implicitly without using labels like ADD or task manager or project manager, but this sort of companies big companies sort themselves out in this way, especially when you're putting together project teams and you're thinking implicitly, well, this person has a lot of great ideas, this person gets things done, and we're not using the clinical label, so it's the same kind of idea. Of course, then there are drugs. Ritalin, otherwise known as methylphenidate, can help ADD people to stay focused, but many report that they feel a loss of creativity. So they finally get things done, but they don't feel that they're doing the best work.
So you mentioned multitasking is bad and essentially not an illusion, right? And you gave references to about switching every 5 minutes or so. Is there data, or do you have a sense of what is the amount of time at least that someone should focus on a task to and then switch?
I think it depends on the task. So there are some things that will only take a minute or two. And if you're trying to create a productive day, it's best to group those all and do them all in like an hour where you do all the little things. It might be going through your emails and sorting them, or you might have to log into a website to find out how much you owe the water company, and then pay your bill. I mean, all these little things, that only takes 2 minutes, and productivity experts say if there's something that takes 2 minutes, do it right now. Or not in the middle of something else, but do it today. Other tasks that are going to require weeks or months of work, things with a long event horizon, I think you really want to be able to put in at least an hour at a time on the task, and maybe carve out 3 or 4 or 5 hours throughout the day when you're just doing that, maybe up to an hour and a half or two. There are big individual differences among the thousands of ways that human beings differ from one another, big differences in how long people can sustain attention, and as you know, it changes throughout the week and throughout the seasons. But I think that for anything we care about, you're looking at closer to an hour than 5 minutes. Although every once in a while you surprise yourself. It's a great song for written in 15 minutes.
What about research into different sorts of activities that you can maybe more successfully do at the same time than others? Like, for example, I remember at a company I used to work on, we did most of our communication by conference call. And so if somebody was like typing or looking at an email, you could definitely tell on the conference call because, they simply just seem to not be able to do both things at the same time. If you ask them to speak, they'd really pause compared to the people that are really concentrating. But, I remember also that I often used to be at home and do something else at the same time, completely different, like washing up or something, and seemed to be able to do that much more successfully at the same time. There's another guy who would run during a conference call. So what research is there on the type of activity that people try and do at the same time?
Well, so I think it's worth thinking about what, I think we all have good intuition about this, what parts of your brain you're using. If you're using verbal parts to talk on the phone and do email and text at the same time, you're not really doing them all at once. On the other hand, if you're standing on a treadmill and reading, that's okay, because you're using different parts of your brain for keeping the exercise going than you are for reading the article. There's an interesting case with driving. Driving actually benefits from multitasking in a very limited way. If you're on a long drive, and you've been driving for a while, you're a competent, experienced driver, and there are no hazards in the road, and it's not a windy road, it's a straight piece of freeway like Highway 5 here, you're going to get bored, and your attention is going to sag, and that's dangerous. So listening to music while you're driving, if it's the right kind of music, not lullabies, but the right kind of music that will raise your physiological arousal level just a bit, will actually make you a better driver, because it's functioning as a stimulant. If the music is too engrossing, if it's trance music, that's pulling you too far out of the driving, so you've got to hit a happy balance.
It's actually kind of a follow-on to the previous question, but how would you classify sort of learning activities in the sense that it seems that when you're learning, especially when you're learning a physical task, like there are aspects of it that you do automatically, and then you have to focus a lot of attention on the bit that you're not familiar with?
That's a great question. So I know the most about learning musical instruments and musical passages, but it applies to a number of other things, to athletics and to acting and to motor learning kinds of things. You're asking about motor learning in particular? So it turns out that just doing the motor movements isn't very efficient or very helpful. You have to be conscious and focused on what you're doing and why you're doing it. So musicians talk about deliberate practice. Piano teachers talk about when you're on the bus, you mentally practicing the piano in your head and picturing where your fingers go. And that when you sit down, you can't just let your fingers go there. You have to be thinking about what they're doing and how they relate to the music in your head or the music on the page. And really, it's a mental exercise as much as a physical one for the practice time to be efficient. And not to just practice by rote, but to practice mindfully.
But I guess what I was trying to ask about is how does that sort of tie into the notion that multitasking is an illusion?
Well, here, I don't see it as multitasking. If you're doing it right, they're completely integrated, right? So the idea of thinking about what you're doing and then getting some feedback about what you actually did, what you thought you were going to do, and then maybe changing it so that make some modifications, that's all part and parcel of when I'm talking about unitasking, I don't mean you can only have one tiny little kernel of thought in your mind. I mean that you're focused on a constellation of ideas that surround a single activity.
So you mentioned before that a 15-minute nap can make up for an hour of sleep. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more how that's physically possible, and if so, why aren't we all just taking 2 hours of naps every night?
Well, if you sleep longer than 15 minutes, you enter longer than about 25 or 30, you enter into deeper sleep, and it's harder to wake up from that. And so long naps in the middle of the day are not helpful. It's really the short naps that are. What's happening is, at nighttime is memory consolidation, and we have only a relatively recent understanding of this role for nighttime sleep. And that is that during your regular 6 or 8 or 10 hour stretch of sleep at night, your neurons are going over the experiences and thoughts and activities of the day and processing them in a way that allows them to get into your long-term memory, turning them over, thinking of links between them, connections, and storing them. If your sleep is disrupted at night, because you stayed up too late, or you woke up too many times, or something like that, it can disturb memories for the previous day for up to weeks or months afterwards. Now, if you're working in an intellectually demanding job, and you're putting in 4 or 5 hours of work in the morning, say from 8 to 1 in the afternoon, when 1 rolls around, your brain's been working pretty hard and taking in a lot of information. And so being able to enter just the first stages of sleep has the effect of hitting a neurophysiological reset button. It relaxes some circuits, you make a few little connections, you're pre-processing stuff for that night's sleep episode. And there's a neurochemical story that I pointed to in an article, a series of articles by Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley.
I have a fun question about vacation. If we go back to that and start planning the next one, how much? Well, I have a couple of questions about your recommendations. Like, how much time do you think is required to take off in order to re-energize for getting back into like a heavy episode of work, like weeks on end? What type of vacation do you think is recommended? You mentioned like taking walks around nature and having a good charge. Does that have any impact on like a longer term stint somewhere? So just kind of like scaling the small naps and walks like out to days and weeks. Like, what's recommended?
I don't know of any literature that recommends a particular amount of time or a particular kind of vacation.
All right.
There may be a vacation doctor out there. I think it's probably the case that nobody's studied this, but if they did, my guess is that they find there are huge individual differences from person to person and from time to time in your life. I'm sure you've all had an experience where you just felt like you needed a day off, and other times where you felt like you just needed 2 weeks or a month off, and it has to do with a lot of factors about what's going on in your life and your brain and your body and your health and nutrition and stress. And stressful episodes can take a very long time to get over. Grief can take months. If it's just regular workday stuff that you're trying to get away from, a shorter vacation would suffice. And if it's the loss of a loved one, it could take months. Not a vacation, but months of recovery.
Actually, I'm a technical writer here at Google, and I've also been a former librarian. And reading your book, it's interesting. A lot of us spend a lot of time on the web. And to pick out the design elements that appeal to the distracted mind and a lot that the focused mind. Can you comment on that? You spend a lot of time on the web.
These are really interesting design questions. The very first search engines were very cluttered and headache-inducing, and Google is well known for having introduced a spare homepage. And I think implicit in your question is that a lot of people like that sparsity, but not everybody does, and it doesn't meet the needs of all different kinds of processing styles. And I imagine there's a literature on this in the computer-human interaction design community, but I'm not familiar with it. I know that for people who are easily distracted, people with attention deficit problems, having that big white space is very intimidating and not very helpful. But then having too much going on would be distracting. There's got to be some balance there. One of the tips I give in the book for people who have attention deficit disorder in terms of filing things, and maybe this is applicable, there's some research that shows that if they can file by color instead of by words, right? So the problem with a lot of people who are easily distracted or have attention deficit is that they can't focus on the words that are written on the tab of a physical file folder, or the names of files on the computer. And so color coding can help. Everything related to a certain project is red. Everything related to another project is green. And then spatially organizing them. So everything related to the Penske file is over here, and everything related to the Miller file is over here, either on the desktop of the computer or on the physical desktop. I remember some years ago, Apple, as part of their OS, had introduced this way of having custom icons for folders. The folder didn't have to look like a folder. It could look like anything. It could be a Simpson character. It could be any JPEG or TIFF. And some people that I know that have these kinds of difficulties and challenges found that very helpful because it allowed them to sort things visually and not have to rely on words.
You mentioned the positive value of reading with respect to recharge and creativity. And being an avid and permanently addicted reader, I'm always looking for some positive value proposition I can sell to my kids. That an hour of literary fiction is more beneficial than an hour of YouTube. And I found it challenging. I wondered if you had any words of wisdom there.
I think it comes down to what the role of art in society is, how we consider the role of art in society. So art in general, and literature in particular, helps us to recontextualize the world, to see things from another perspective, to see things from a particular person's perspective, maybe somebody from a different background, different age, a different set of worldviews. We learn to empathize with other viewpoints and other people. And we learn to see in this recontextualization process connections between things where we didn't see those connections before. And this can stimulate all kinds of neural processes where we're momentarily comparing our lives to the lives we're reading about. We identify with some of the characters and imagine what we would do in these situations. And this is a tremendously important experience for boosting creativity and empathy and understanding of the world. And I do think that the role of art is to do those things. I don't think the purpose of art is to make us better at math or to simply be a way to fill time between work hours and sleep. I think art is supposed to challenge us to think differently. And great literature can do that. And I mean that about literary fiction as well as literary nonfiction and poetry. And that very act of having your mind wander while you're reading is part of the treasure of it. And I think it needs to be encouraged. Now, of course, watching TV is different, or YouTube videos, watching moving images is different because you can't really control the pace like you can when you're reading. And I guess you can hit the pause button, but people don't. In reading, though, you can take your time and you can go back over it very easily. I think it helps us to recontextualize the world, to see things from another perspective. Color files over here, balance there. One of the tips I give in the book for people who have attention deficit disorder in terms of filing things, and maybe this is applicable, there's some research that shows that if they can file by color instead of by words, right? So the problem with a lot of people who are easily distracted or have attention deficit is that they can't focus on the words that are written on the tab of a physical file folder or the names of files on the computer. And so color coding can help. Everything related to a certain project is red. Everything related to another project is green. And then spatially organizing them. So everything related to the Pensy files over here and everything related to the Miller files over here, either on the desktop of the computer or on the physical desktop. I remember some years ago, Apple, as part of their OS, had introduced this way of having custom icons for the folders. The folder didn't have to look like a folder. It could look like anything. It could be a Simpsons character. It could be any JPEG or TIFF. And some people that I know that had these kinds of difficulties and challenges found that very helpful because it allowed them to sort things visually and not have to rely on words.
You mentioned the positive value of reading with respect to recharge and creativity, and being an avid and permanently addicted reader. I'm always looking for some positive value proposition I can sell to my kids. That an hour of literary fiction is more beneficial than an hour of YouTube. And I found it challenging. I wondered if you had any words of wisdom in that area.
I think it comes down to what the role of art in society is, how we consider the role of art in society. So art in general, and literature in particular, helps us to recontextualize the world, to see things from another perspective, to see things from a particular person's perspective, maybe somebody from a different background, different age, different set of worldviews. We learn to empathize with other viewpoints and other people. And we learn to see in this recontextualization process connections between things where we didn't see those connections before. And this can stimulate all kinds of neural processes where we're momentarily comparing our lives to the lives we're reading about. We identify with some of the characters and imagine what we would do in these situations. And this is a tremendously important experience for boosting creativity and empathy and understanding of the world. And I do think that the role of art is to do those things. I don't think the purpose of art is to make us better at math or to simply be a way to fill time between work hours and sleep. I think art is supposed to challenge us to think differently. And great literature can do that. And I mean that about literary fiction as well as literary nonfiction and poetry. And that very act of having your mind wander while you're reading is part of the treasure of it. And I think it needs to be encouraged. Now, of course, watching all of art is to do those things. I don't think the purpose of art is to make us better at math or to simply be a way to fill time between work hours and sleep. I think art is supposed to challenge us to think differently, and great literature can do that. And I mean that about literary fiction as well as literary nonfiction and poetry. And that very act of having your mind wander while you're reading is part of the treasure of it. And I think it needs to be encouraged. Now, of course, watching with some of the characters and imagine what we would do in these situations. And this is a tremendously important experience for boosting creativity and empathy and understanding of the world. And I do think that the role of art is to do those things. I don't think the purpose of art is to make us better at math or to simply be a way to fill time between work hours and sleep. I think art is supposed to challenge us to think differently. And great literature can do that. And I mean that about literary fiction as well as literary nonfiction and poetry. And that very act of having your mind wander while you're reading is part of the treasure of it. And I think it needs to be encouraged. Now, of course, watching TV is different, or YouTube videos. Watching moving images is different because you can't really control the pace like you can when you're reading. And I guess you can hit the pause button, but people don't. In reading, though, you can take your time. You can go back over it very easily. I think it's important to encourage children to do that. And again, I think some of the world's biggest problems are more apt to be solved by people who have taken inspiration from the arts.
So kind of a follow-up on the video part of it. What I've noticed is that we tend to classify videos as very much like, okay, these are cat videos, or these are distracting, and so on and so forth. But at least in my mind, and when I compare my own experience, say, an hour and a half reading some literary fiction versus reading Twitter, right? I mean, there's a world of difference. But interestingly, I notice there's the same difference if I watch a 2.5 hour documentary on something like Ken Burns made, for example, versus something on YouTube. So is there any data, or do you have any comment on the quality of video that you can watch as opposed to?
Well, I would put Ken Burns in the category of literary nonfiction. Right? His documentaries employ artistic techniques, narrative momentum, character development, and so I think they're functioning in a more artistic capacity. Just because they're nonfiction doesn't mean they're not artistic, of course.
So my question is about napping in the day and at work. So I've never tried this, and the only time I remember napping was, after having kids, when the tiredness just made me nap. So I'm wondering about how do you get into this, and I'm also wondering about the comment you made about you have to make sure not to go into too deep a sleep. So set an alarm. How does all that work?
So some people can more easily take naps than others. Some people fall asleep very quickly, some people don't, and there are individual differences here. If you're the kind of person that takes 15 to 30 minutes to fall asleep at night, it's less likely that you'll be able to carve time out of your day at work. It's not just like you can slip into the nap room and come out 15 minutes later. And so knowing that about yourself is important. And maybe instead of taking naps, you'll engage in other restorative brain activities. You might be listening to music or reading a novel or taking a walk around the building, looking at art pictures or something of fine art. So to some extent, you're stuck with your neurogenetic makeup in terms of whether you're someone who falls asleep quickly. If you do fall asleep quickly, and a lot of people do set alarms after 15 minutes so that they don't enter that deeper sleep. Now, I know there are exceptions. When you're talking about human physiology, there are a lot of exceptions. I know somebody who takes 2-hour naps every day. Gets a full 8 hours sleep at night, takes 2-hour naps in the afternoon, and that works for her. But on average, it doesn't work for the rest of us because it's putting you in too deep a sleep mode and you wake up with a mental fog. And if the body also has these internal clocks that expect the same thing every time of the day. So if you can arrange your life this way that you can try to take a nap at the same time every day and eat your meals at the same time every day because they work in your cycle and exercise at the same time, you might find that with a little practice after a week or two that your naps are coming more easily because your body's conditioned for it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a musician, and of course, like most musicians, I have a day job. My day job is that I run a laboratory, a cognitive neuroscience laboratory, which is a fancy way of thinking that we study thinking. A fancy way of saying we study thinking. Try to figure out what goes on in the brain when people are paying attention to things or not paying attention to them. And in particular, we're interested in the intersection between music and the brain. And a lot of people think, well, why would you want to mix science and art? Science and music, they seem like two things that don't go together at all. As Stephen Jay Gould might have said, they're non-overlapping magisteria that should stay as far apart from one another as possible because they might contaminate one another. But I'm reminded of a quote by my colleague, Robert Sapolsky, who says, the arts are not meant to ruin science. They're actually meant to reinvigorate and allow us to re-experience science. And science is meant to reinvigorate art. And I found this to be very true, that in my own work, every time I think that I'm on the verge of uncovering some new mystery in the laboratory, something about how music works, 5 new ones pop up. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. I can never keep up. And in fact, as Sapolsky says, science isn't meant to demystify it, it's meant to reinvigorate it, and that's been my experience. And I wanted to share some of that with you. So if you had taken a class 20 years ago in psychology or neuroscience, you would have learned that music happens in the right side of the brain and language happens in the left. And we now no longer think that's true. It's a gross oversimplification. Instead, what's happening is a lot of subtle activity in both sides of the brain. In fact, in my own laboratory where we do brain scans of people while they listen to music, we found that music activates every region of the brain that has so far been mapped. Music's on the right, on the left, in the front, in the back, on the top, and the bottom. And we are now beginning to understand that more so than anything else, music is a kind of food or fuel for the brain. I'll give you just one example. Over the last couple of years, if you've watched the Olympics, you've seen athletes with earbuds. What are they doing? They're listening to music. Why? I don't know that the athletes necessarily know the science behind this, but they've realized that it works. The neurons in your brain fire in synchrony to the tempo of the music that you're listening to. So if you're a runner and you can get music that's at a slightly faster pace than you would normally run, and then your neurons are firing at that pace, you can actually run faster. Same thing for weightlifters doing repetitions. If they're trying to increase the repetition rate, any athletic activity that involves some kind of timing, music, if it's carefully chosen, can actually help you to perform better. And because of the constant pulse of music, as you've probably seen, if you try it for jogging or for exercising, the constant pulse keeps you going. Even when your willpower flags or you think you want to stop and take a break, the constant pulse gives you this kind of momentum and pushing you forward. A little bit more about what's happening in the brain when we listen to music. There are a number of processes that go on, and it's not obvious, but let me use an analogy to vision. When you look out across the room and you see different people and different objects and different colors, what you may not realize is that each of these attributes of things are processed in separate regions of the brain. So light comes in through your retina, it ends up being transmitted through neural transmission to the back of your brain, where your visual cortex is, and at that point, everything gets sent out to special processing circuits in the brain. So color is processed in one part of the brain, the shape of something in another, its spatial location in yet another. If the object is moving, that's in a separate area, and it all comes together later, so that if I'm holding up a red apple and a green apple, the color and the shape and the location get bound about 40 milliseconds after the light actually hits your retina. The same thing is true with music. As soon as the music passes through your eardrums, which are wiggling in and out in response to vibrations in the air, this sets off an electrochemical chain of events, and different processing units in the auditory cortex extract the pitch of the music versus the rhythm versus the timbre, that is the total color of the instrument that it is, and then after that, the loudness, and it all comes together later, but it happens so fast and so seamlessly that you don't realize that it's been fractionated like that. Again, 30 milliseconds, 30 thousandths of a second later maybe, it all comes together. And the interesting thing here is that we've now seen support for this, evidence for this, from a number of different converging sources. We've seen it in neuroimaging studies, where we scan people's brains, but we've also seen it in patients. Due to a stroke or a lesion or some sort of brain trauma, we've seen patients who lose the rhythm, but they have all the other parts of music, or they lose the pitch, but they still can process rhythm. I guess people who lose pitch and can still process rhythm are drummers. No, just kidding. But this idea of the components I think is really fascinating, and it underscores the complexity of music and really the miraculousness of how it does all come together and give us that great sense of joy. There's another thing that's interesting, it's come out of the laboratory just in the last few years that I wanted to share with you, and that has to do with music's health effects. Now, there have been a lot of stories about music as medicine, and for years it was all just anecdote. And in science, it's important to remember that the plural of anecdote is not data. Anecdotes are just stories. Data comes from careful and systematic observations, following the scientific method, having control groups and such. And there were lots and lots of stories about the power of music, but not a lot of data. But fortunately, in the last 5 years, diligent researchers have started collecting some of this data. And it's interesting what we've discovered. Music does function as medicine in some contexts. For example, listening to pleasurable music releases dopamine, the so-called feel-good hormone in the brain, and can function in that sense almost like an antidepressant. If you're sad and you suffer either from clinical depression or you're just feeling regular old sad without any clinical psychopathology, what do? Often people reach for sad music, and they find that it helps them to feel better. Now you might be thinking, why would they do that? Why wouldn't somebody who was sad reach for happy music? And the reason is that when you're sad or depressed, you're usually feeling misunderstood. Like the people around you don't understand you, and that's contributing to these feelings of sadness, is the sense of detachment. And so if somebody comes along and says, oh, you ought to listen to some happy music, you just feel even less understood. You want to kick them in the face. So if you put on the right piece of sad music, you go, oh, that's how I feel. This person understands me. This musician gets it. They've been through it. And they're expressing it so beautifully. They not only had this terrible experience where they felt they were at the bottom of a cliff, but they somehow managed to get out of it and come through it and turn it into this beautiful work of art. So the sad music turns out to be soothing, unlike the happy music when you're feeling sad. And we now know that listening to sad music releases prolactin. This is the same chemical that's released when mothers nurse their babies. It's a soothing hormone that makes you feel comforted. Another thing that music does is it increases the production of immunoglobulin A. IgA, as you may know, is responsible for mucosal immunity, for disorders of the mucous system, colds, flus, and things like that. And listening to pleasurable music boosts the production of IgA. It also helps to boost the production of NK, that is natural killer cells, T cells, to help boost the immune system overall. And it reduces cortisol levels. Cortisol is the stress hormone, and it's toxic. And you don't want to have too much of it in your bloodstream. It leads to fatigue and cloudy thinking. Now, the interesting thing here, people always ask me, what music should I listen to? And the interesting part of it is, you probably already know. As music therapy evolves as a field, I don't think you're going to go to a doctor, a music doctor, and have them say, oh, depression, take 2 Joni Mitchells and call me in the morning. Everybody knows already what music does for them, most of us anyway. Certainly if you're here in this talk tonight, we have an exquisitely sensitive notion of how the music in our lives makes us feel. And the majority of people use music every day for mood regulation. You listen to a certain kind of music in the morning to help us get going, a different kind of music at night to unwind. There's a kind of music you use to get through your exercise workout. And in effect, we're using music like we use drugs. You use caffeine to get up in the morning, alcohol to calm down after a fight with somebody, or with enough alcohol to get into a fight with somebody. But the idea is that music is regulating the hormones and the neurotransmitters effectively the way that drugs do. So the answer to music therapy is for doctors and patients, or just any of us on our own, to recognize that music has this power over us, this influence on us, and to use it, to be systematic about it. Create a playlist that will help you do whatever activity it is that you're doing. The other thing that is interesting is that the playlists really, in general, work better when you're the one selecting the music. There was a study that just came out a couple of years ago where people in a pre-operative setting in a hospital, in an experiment, were either given Valium, which is what you normally give them, benzodiazepine to calm them down before surgery, or they were given music. And either they were given music that the doctor gave them, or music that they could choose themselves. And the people who could choose their own music showed much less anxiety than the people who had Valium or the people who had the music forced on them. And the great thing about music is, in this context, is that it's organic, it doesn't have any side effects, and it's relatively cheap, practically free. I wanted to close with just another topic that I cover in the book, This Is Your Brain on Music, that I've become fascinated by over the last decade. I began my career as a recording engineer and a record producer, and I was always fascinated by the idea that some musicians really are better than others. And what is it that makes for a great musician? And how is it that they become that? The Yo-Yo Ma's, the Paul McCartneys of the world, where do they get it from? Is musical talent innate? Is it genetic? Or is it just a lot of hard work? And the emerging picture from the study of expertise, not just studying musical experts, but expertise in a variety of domains, including chess players and athletes and writers and scientists, is that it's mostly a lot of hard work and it's not genetic. And one of the strongest pieces of evidence for this in music comes from an experiment that was done in England, where students who entered a conservatory were judged the day they arrived. A panel of 4 musicians listened to them play and rated them. Now let's consider 2 opposing accounts of how it is that people become great musicians. Either you're just born with it, in which case it's talent, or you work really, really hard, in which case it's hard work. So the students enter the conservatory, they're rated on a scale of 1 to 100 for how good they are, and then they're each given a diary, and they're told to write down in the diary every time they practice, how long they practice, what they practice, and so on.